Welcome back. Just before the break, we were talking about the poverty levels, and my guest was talking about Sierra Leone. Was that?
Yes, I was
Yes.
talking about Sierra
All
as
right.
an example.
We move to a different area, but the same topic about development and economic development and the role of United Nations in developing, helping develop or alleviate poverty. I did not say eradicate poverty, so my guest will probably talk about that. As the world changes and the international community seeks to define a new development agenda, what is a development agenda?
I think we always have done kind of the development agenda at the country level. I mean, you know that lots of countries used to have 5-year plans, 3-year plans, which are
very subjective, isn't it?
Yes, and they're very kind of a blueprints. You have certain goals, you have certain strategies, you allocate resources. But nowadays, with the globalized world and also with the interlinkages of different societies, 3 things have become very important. One is that for the development of any country is not only dependent on its own efforts, but it is very much influenced by what is happening in the outside world, what is happening to trade, what is happening to capital flows. The policies of one country are very much dependent on the policies of other countries. So that's one. The second thing is that there was also a time when we always used to think that the knowledge and technology used to go from the north to the south. I think that has also changed. Now there are South-South collaboration, there are South-South expertise, there are South-South examples, dissemination, that kind of thing. And the third, we now appreciate more that development is not only resource-centric. We can't claim that give me 50 billion today and I'll take care of global poverty tomorrow. It doesn't happen that way. It's a complex process. So given those 3 things, it has been a realization at the global community that in addition to national efforts, there has to be some kind of a commitment by humanity as a whole to improve the situation. And that does not come from any kind of a moral obligation. There is a moral obligation, of course, but that comes also from the fact that there is an extended interest. If, for example, there are problems in any part of the world, you cannot say that I'll be insulated from that problem. It's going to affect you. It's going to haunt you at one point.
Not anymore.
Yeah. So that was one of the reasons that the world has said, well, let's have some ambitious development goals and let us work together as a global community to achieve those things. Will those goals would be achieved in 20 years or 30 years? No.
What are the stumbling blocks?
The stumbling blocks are at different points. One stumbling block is that even at the national level, as you know, that the commitment of different countries and the commitment of different governments, it varies. Some countries are very committed, they have their resources, they have their strategies. Some countries pay some kind of a lip service to this kind of the goals. It doesn't happen. Second, I think there are also asymmetries in terms of the developing countries and the developed world. If we look at some of the issues that is bothering us now, I mean, we often talk about the Syrian refugees, we often talk about the people who have been displaced. And I know that Europe always says we are overburdened by all these things. But the fact is that 90% of these refugees are actually in 3 or 4 countries, Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, that kind of thing. So therefore, I think there is an asymmetry of the interest, if I may put it that way, between the developed world and the developing world. And that actually affects the development of Latin America, Africa, Asia, and those countries. If you look at the trade situation, there are tariffs, there are different kind of barriers to trade. Sometimes the whole issue of the environmental standard and social standards are being used to block kind of imports from developing countries, and that's a huge thing. And finally, I think in many areas, pharmaceutical is obviously one example, the whole question of the intellectual property rights, it actually constrains some developing countries to get the best out of it. one particular example, I will say the HIV/AIDS drugs. And we know that when these drugs are no longer generic and they are produced by companies like Squibb or Pfizer, the prices are so high that it's beyond the purchasing capacity of developing countries. So South Africa, India, they have started a kind of collaboration, particularly the Indian company Cipla with South Africa, to bring out some generic drugs which are cheaper and everything. The moment they did, the pharmaceutical industry have brought those cases to the World Trade Organization and tried to block it. So these are some of the kind of the constraints. Partly it is resource, partly it is the asymmetry between developed and developing countries and their interest.
What will be the role of UNDP in that? I mean, could you play a role?
I think we can play a role. I think one of the roles that we can play and we are playing is actually, since we say that we have a broader presence compared to other UN agencies, the kind of the role we play, that we try to provide a kind of a platform for mutual dialogue. It can be bilateral, it can be multilateral, and sometimes it helps, because sometimes we try to emphasize that it is in the extended self-interest of everybody concerned and that these things have to be done. The other is that, as I have mentioned, that sometimes there are good examples on the ground and we try to disseminate those examples. By doing so, the countries sometimes find solutions to the problems, not necessarily from the north, but from the south. In lots of areas, we have seen that how the south have been collaborating with each other. Two particular examples I would like to put forward. One is that in poverty reduction, there is the whole question of the social protection programs, conditional cash transfers in Brasilia, that are being implemented and pursued in Africa. Similarly, India has a program of guaranteed employment schemes, which is basically being pursued in Latin America. So the UNDP is basically a kind of a honest broker in the whole process, where they provide the platform for dissemination of knowledge, while they also try to bring all the actors together.
You call it honest because it doesn't have any intention of its own to benefit
Absolutely,
itself.
Absolutely. And then, since it is an organ of the UN system, I think it also is very much credible in that sense, that it does not have any kind of an agenda of its own which it wants to impose on countries concerned. That may not be said in terms of, say, multilateral development banks, because bank is a bank and it has its own interest. Yes.
You're not out there to make profits. See.
Absolutely not.
Banks are out there
banks
to make
are
profits.
Out there. Yes, I think that's the best way.
They're dealing with money. There are a few things that I picked up. New analytical tools, promoting innovative new ideas. You have talked about some of them. Advocating practical policy changes, constantly challenging policies and approaches that advance human development. They all sound very nice. More to me, because I'm a kind of a person who would take anything to be true. But does it really work out there in the field? I mean, United Nations is a very large organization, and a lot of people look at it with one eye closed, that it has failed in achieving some of its goals. But UNDP is a success story, definitely. But when you try to implement some of the policies you suggest that governments should say, do you really find that the governments are friendly towards you? They really want to do it, or they want to have the status quo? They think that, because sometimes it helps them to be in the position of power that they are, and they would not like the people to be educated, people to have the choice, as you said, of economic development. So what would you do in that circumstances, and what's your experience?
I think that's a very important and insightful question. let me respond it at two levels. One is that as far as the UN is concerned, I'm talking about broader UN, in developing countries, sometimes we try to look at UN only from its political mandate, which is very difficult. And I won't claim that UN has succeeded always in terms of pushing forward the kind of the political mandate that it has. But the other part of the UN
as the UN Assembly, it has its limitations.
Of course it has its limitations. It has its limitations, and if I may say quite bluntly, that the whole UN system was set up in the aftermath of the Second World War. The world that we used to have in 1945 is not the same world here in 2018. If I give a very simple example, at that point in time, China, India, Nigeria, Brazil were no powers. But nowadays, if you look at China or India or Brazil, they have emerged as a kind of a global power. And in that context, the whole question of the importance and the power of some of the permanent members of the Security Council can be questioned. The whole structure of the Security Council, having 5 permanent members with veto powers by each one of them, sometimes make things difficult for the UN on the political level. Having said that, what I would argue is that sometimes the economic and development work of the UN system is not reflected that much. And as you know, that UN system was set up on 2 legs. One is freedom from war and freedom from want. So the freedom from want is the economic one, and I think this is where the UNDP and other organizations are working very well. Coming back to your questions, when you work in different countries, there should not be any kind of understanding that all the governments are very friendly, all the governments are cooperative, all the governments are very much interested in enhancing the lives of their people.
But isn't it in their own interest?
Sometimes, you see, the life of a government is about 5 years. 5 years. So sometimes they fail to see the longer term perspective of that. Yes, it is their own interest, but sometimes they also think that within these 5 years, to get the maximum out of that, they often have policies which may not be friendly to people. They may often have strategies which may, in many cases, actually stifle the voices of people. They may not have created the kind of the political, for example, platform where there can be more dialogues and all kinds of things. Now, in such situations, I think the way UNDP works is basically with local institutions. If there are, for example, local NGOs, academia, and we try to work with them so that there are local voices which may raise that. In many cases, if I may say, we also use different narratives to reach the government. One critical example is when you work in the Arab states or the Middle East, poverty, the word poverty is a no-no. So you cannot talk about national poverty programs. So we have changed it to national prosperity program. You see, so
catching the cat by the tail.
Exactly. The narrative remains the same, but when you talk about prosperity and you say, well, we want prosperity for country X, that is more acceptable to government. So it's a question of how you actually push your agenda using different strategies, if I may use the word, different tactics. And in all those processes, you have to have the kind of the ownership of the people, work with the people, and you don't try to come to a particular place or particular country, irrespective of the fact that they may be quite antagonistic to you, with the idea that you know it all, or you can dictate what they can do.
Okay, sir, once again, it's the same time. It's the time that we have to take a break. Thank you for being with us. We'll be back after this short break. Thank you.